Good morning and good afternoon to you wherever you may be today. Thank you so much for joining us. And for those who have joined us for the first time, our webinar series is focused on HR and workplace topics with a lens of culture, DEI, and sustainability. My name is Dr. Tiffany Ingram, and I am a DEI advisor at OurOffice, where we help organizations with proven, effective, and affordable solutions for planning, managing, measuring, and engaging everyone to drive a more inclusive workplace experience for all individuals to belong and to be productive. Today, I am super excited to be joined by Alexandra Gilbert, the founder and CEO of Capable Consulting, and Dr. Brittany Patrick, Director of Education Management and Opportunity Consulting. Welcome to you both. Before we get started with the meat of our conversation today, I want to make sure that you're familiar with some logistics. We use Zoom webinar tool, which many of you all are familiar with. This is an interactive webinar, so please feel free to use the chat function and provide your comments and any questions that you may have throughout our discussion today. We have one of our colleagues at our office, Anishka, is here to support me in moderating the discussion in real time and chiming in as needed. Thank you so much in advance, Anishka. We will answer as many questions we can at the end of our discussion today. And afterwards, if needed, as long as you provide your email address when you ask your question. Please note this session is being recorded and will be available after the webinar on our events page at ouroffice.io/events. Last but not least, the webinar is approved for both SHRM and HRCI recertification credits, and we will share those activity codes later in our discussion. So we're going to stop the slide share and just get right into the meat of potatoes with our wonderful panelists. I want to give each of you an opportunity to introduce yourself and kind of what connects you to the work today. We'll start it off with Brittany.
Good afternoon, all. Dr. Brittany Patrick. I am a Black woman with long Black hair, glasses. Today, I'm wearing a blazer. And behind me, my screen is kind of blurred. I am the Director of Education Engagement for Opportunity Consulting in Washington, D.C. And I'm also founder of Umoja Collective, which is a mission-driven organization that connects families of students with disabilities with resources and culturally competent special education professionals. I'm super excited to join today's conversation with over 11 years of experience supporting neurodiverse communities, including as a caretaker and a foster parent, and also as one who identifies as neurodivergent, having been diagnosed with a learning disability in my doctoral program. And so very excited to engage in today's conversation and great to meet everyone.
Thanks so much for sharing, Brittany. Alex, I would love to turn it over to you. Just share a little bit about yourself, your organization, and your professional and personal connection to our discussion today.
First of all, I love how Brittany introduced herself, so I'm going to do the same. My name is Alex Gilbert, and I am a white woman wearing a blue shirt with my background also blurred because my living room's a mess because I have a 9-month-old. But my company is called Capable Consulting, and the reason that I had started this business is because I was really privileged to be diagnosed with dyslexia and ADHD when I was 8 years old and had resources all the way through college. And when I started in the workplace, I really struggled to figure out how to navigate conversations with bosses, how to even go through the interview process, how do you manage my disability in the workplace, because everything that I had learned up until this point was for school and nothing really applied anymore. So I spent over a decade in program and leadership development from the lens of someone who has a disability and how I can make a lot of programs much more simplified and help pull people's strengths. And after the pandemic hit and I lost my job, I looked at my husband and we laughed and we're like, okay, it's time to start this business. So I have been working with clients in a one-on-one space and also working as a consultant for a lot of different companies to find new ways to be inclusive to those who have learning disabilities and ADHD in the workplace.
Thank you so much for sharing those wonderful intros. And I'm so excited to have this discussion today because I think the lens in which both of you all are coming at this subject, I am so excited to really have this discussion. And as many folks know, April is Autism Acceptance Month. And for many advocates in the disability community, the goal is to shift the focus from awareness to acceptance of autism and to promote a more inclusive and respectful society for not just folks on the spectrum, but really this conversation is about many neurodiverse persons and how they can be included in the discussion and get the support needed in the workplace as well. And when speaking about diversity, equity, inclusion, so often neurodiversity is forgotten. We do a lot of sessions, even on our platform, around race, around gender. We have one coming up next month about age, but I do think that we leave out of the discussion ability. So I'm really excited to have this discussion today. And folks understand that no two brains are alike. Everyone thinks, processes information, learns, and works in different ways. And reframing these differences as an important and valuable component of diversity helps us capture them as strengths. So just to root our conversation today around the discussion about what is neurodiversity, and I think some folks, this may be their first time hearing this term. So just to frame the discussion, neurodiversity is the range of differences in individual brain function and behavioral traits. And neurodiversity refers to the range of differences among individuals, and folks may see this be described in connecting, discussing Autism Spectrum Disorder, or ASD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, ADHD, dyslexia, and many other conditions. Studies show that currently between 15 and 20% of our population is neurodiverse, including up to 10% of people diagnosed with dyslexia and around 5% with ADHD. I really want us to connect this to the workplace, our discussion today. And I would love to hear from both of you to kind of speak on one of the benefits of even having this conversation and people being aware, but what are some benefits of having a neurodiverse workforce, and how can employers really promote diversity and inclusion in those hiring practices? And maybe Brittany will kick it off, and then we'll turn to Alex to see her thoughts as well.
Sure. Yeah. I'm thinking of many benefits, but, we do often talk about diversity of thought, right? Simply having different voices at the table. But when we really zoom into different disabilities, there are some trends in where certain populations are exceptionally skilled, more than the standard person. Right. I think the rate is like 62% or so of the autistic community has some exceptional talent or ability. Right. And oftentimes this is a technical skill that can advance the workforce that we overlook. So when I'm thinking about hiring specifically, I'm thinking about an inclusive recruitment process. Even down to a job description. Are we stating on our job descriptions that we're welcoming neurodiverse candidates to apply, right? Are the job descriptions available in readable font, right? And when we really think about that interview process, how can we flip an interview process or be flexible in an interview process to the needs of a unique individual? So, I'm thinking about what does it look like to put a performance task before meeting an individual in person or via Zoom to give them an opportunity for us to judge their skill, right? Before we know anything else. So, those are just a few things that come to mind in this conversation about recruitment and the benefits of hiring neurodiverse learners for me.
Thanks so much for sharing, Brittany. And Alex, please feel free to jump in and kind of where you see it from your lens, your personal experience, and the clients that you work with.
I'd love to. And I want to tag onto something that Brittany said. I think that it's one thing to say that you're accepting of neurodivergent employees. It's another to actually take action through the interview process. And as you were mentioning, the whole processing piece of doing an assessment before, I personally actually deter a lot of my clients from doing those because they're typically timed. They have a lot of written directions, and ones that if you are very anxious, like let's say anxiety come naturally to you when you are in those testing settings, you don't necessarily see the best. I was thinking about a client in particular who is in an MBA program, and she is trying to find her internship for the summer. And she has been looking specifically for companies who are neurodivergent. And one of the companies where she interviewed and where she ended up taking her internship not only said that they were accepting of neurodivergent employees, but actually changed the interview process for her. They said, this is what we put in place to make it easier for you, whether it was an extended time in between the interviews because they had to interview with multiple people. They offered to have it be in person, virtual, over the phone. There was an element of, they sent her questions beforehand so that if she couldn't recall, that she had answers to the side. It made her feel infinitely more confident, and they, within minutes of hanging up with her, called her and said they wanted to have the next round. So that told me she was set up for success through the process, and through being there, they would probably see the best of her because they have made that such an apparent piece of their value in their company. Personally, having dyslexia and ADHD and feeling very comfortable talking about it, I often talked about my strengths in the interview process and shared the fact that I had dyslexia and ADHD because we have so many unique strengths of problem solving and being creative and seeing the big picture and the little details. We can make things way more efficient and find support and have this higher emotional intelligence than those who are neurotypical in a lot of these settings. And so these are skills that we want to foster. And if we have the right environment to do that, you're going to get the best version of those employees.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think there are so many misconceptions about neurodiverse employees, and there, in preparation for our discussion today, I did a lot of research on it in terms of what are some studies that are out there and what are employers saying about maybe their concerns about hiring neurodiverse employees. And there are these misconceptions out here of maybe beliefs that their neurodiverse employees may be incapable of doing their job or difficult to work with, if they require a whole lot of special treatment. But then there's so many conversations out there about how there's unique skill sets and perspectives that they bring to the workplace. Can you share a little bit more about the awareness? Alex, it seems like there are some companies that get it and willing to make accommodations, but what has been your overall experience? And Brittany, feel free to chime in too, but with neurodiversity in the workplace and people being accepting of difference overall and willing to support and accommodate employees. Alex?
First of all, you just explained why I named my company Capable Consulting, because I wanted people to know that they were capable regardless of having a disability. And that is a very common misconception, that someone who has a learning disability or ADHD or neurodiversity in some way is not capable of their job. It's not that they're not capable. They're very capable. It's how you set up the environment for them. And one of the things that I work with a lot of companies to do is, as part of their onboarding experience, create something that's not only helpful for someone who has some neurodiverse elements, but really helpful for everybody overall. I've described this as, you have a ramp to your front door. That front door is now accessible by someone who is in a wheelchair, using a walker, crutches, a parent with a stroller, an able-bodied person walking through the door. The systems that I'm talking about make it much more productive for everybody else. So I tend to talk to companies about providing services like Grammarly and Speechify, which Speechify reads everything to you. You can use it on your phone, you can use it on your computer. If you're already having that on the computers you're giving to them, that sends a message. Same with Grammarly. It not only reads your emails, but helps you make sure that your sentences make sense. If you said you were going to send an attachment, that it's actually there. It tells you the tone of your emails. I know many people who have ADHD who are going to be very impulsive and send the wrong thing to the wrong person, and it will call you out on it. And that could save a lot of grief, but that's going to be helpful to someone else who doesn't have any kind of neurodivergency. So I try and take it from that perspective, and a lot of the workshops that I do for companies are related to how you can communicate your needs, and this goes across the board. So if you are a manager of someone who's neurodiverse, how you can explain what your needs are and be vulnerable in those moments helps the person advocate for themselves and say, well, this is what I need, and this is what success looks like for me. And I walk people through those styles of communication to make it easier for everybody.
Can I add to that, Dr. Ingram? You know, Alex, you mentioned this universally designed workplace, and I think you're right on par. And I think about even things that we may perceive as little or insignificant, like sending a meeting agenda before a meeting. Right? Things like, you mentioned the access to assistive technology, and it made me think about how like the Audible app has changed the world because we're now all able to access text through audio. So, just simply the ability to consume information in different ways. And I'm hearing this theme of flexibility coming up in everything that we're saying. We're like talking about the need to be flexible ultimately in how we're viewing and designing the workplace. And I think we're right on par.
I would also like to add to that in terms of meetings. I talk to a lot of companies about having very long meetings and how it really breaks up your productivity, and especially someone who has ADHD or learning disability, that ability to sit for 2-3 hours for a whole meeting is just going to crush their day and productivity. So one, if you do have the ability to send an agenda, I think that is very helpful. I also find it helpful to, you're recording, this webinar, you have the ability to use the transcript so that there's notes. So if you're going to send this out afterwards, you can say, look, we have the recording, we have the transcript. If you miss something, you at least have a time frame that you can refer back to. And I think that can be really helpful for, again, everybody.
100%. I feel like you all bring up amazing topics that I feel like myself and Brittany, coming from education by trade, these are things that we teach in the classroom and that we're supporting teachers and implementing how we can support diverse learners in the classroom. But you're very right, Alex. When we get to the workplace, it's just kind of like, oh, it doesn't matter how all folks learn. But I think even as we transition into our more virtual platform and format in life, working remotely, we have this ability to access these additional accommodations that are super helpful. Grammarly, I feel like I need it in my life. Like it is required for me to be able to be put out my best work. And that is I feel like it's a support for everyone. You bring up really good points about also these very long meetings that happen. And I just feel like it can stunt the growth in even the creativity of anyone, just sitting in this lecture style format, almost like we're back at college, where it didn't really work well for many people there, and it's definitely not going to work well in the workplace. We do have a question in the chat, and I really want to highlight it. Folks said, after hiring, how might we work to retain and grow neurodiverse employees? I myself with ADHD find the workplace challenging regarding motivation, social aspects, and learning style. This person also works in HR, so she would love your perspective. And actually Alana, that was my next question. How can, twofold, how can employers be better? And how can employees kind of ask for more as well, from your perspective, in terms of growing and retaining our neurodiverse talent? What can employers do?
I'm happy to jump in, Brittany, if that's okay. Okay. Again, I'm going to go back to this style of communication because I think something that people with ADHD or learning disabilities feel very uncomfortable about is talking about the skills that they lack. And they feel like they should be good at everything. And instead of actually asking for help, they take on way more and end up doing way less. And they don't necessarily know how to ask for help. So one of the things that I often try and help, I'm going to do this in two perspectives, one from the employee and the other from the manager perspective. From the employee perspective, I think it's really important to understand what your needs are and what specific, wow, that wasn't a word, specific and tangible next steps that you can take to get the support that you need. So here we were talking about these very long meeting structures, and you know that that's really not great for your productivity and is really frustrating for you. How can you go into a conversation with your manager or your VP of your department and say, these meeting structures are really difficult for me to pay attention and get all of the work done that I need. You can talk about it in the way of, here's what I have on my list. How would you like me to best use my time? And usually it will be not sitting in that meeting, or it would be in that meeting, and then you can talk about different ways to get the notes that you need to make sure that you can pay attention to the parts that are valuable to you. Again, you want to go into the conversation knowing what you want out of it. And in terms of the employer and the manager of the department or for you, I think it's really important to show your vulnerability of what skills that you lack and need support on. Because if you can open up the conversation to show you are not perfect and that you need support and what that looks like for you, they might be able to help you with those skills. And that actually might be the part that they're hired for, because those are the skills that they have, and make it a much more approachable conversation. Every single job description, I don't care what it is, no one is a perfect match for every aspect of that job. And it's okay to know that about yourself. And it's okay for the employee and the company to know that you are not going to get 100% of this person, but the parts that you value the most are the parts that you want to put forward. And what does that look like to support them?
And I'd love to add to that retention conversation by saying, we really have to revisit our mindset around supporting, coaching, managing neurodiverse individuals. I think oftentimes we see it as providing extra help, when really it's typically not more, it's different. And so we're disrupting the typical way that we might manage or coach or offer support or have a conversation. I recently had a conversation with a young lady who was put on a performance improvement plan at her job because she wasn't meeting the expectations of her manager. And she mentioned that the specific guidance offered through the performance improvement plan, like those clear action steps, those metrics, those specific improvement goals, she thought that was such a great way of being managed and receiving coaching and receiving clear direction. And she questioned, why wasn't I being offered this level of guidance and coaching and communication from the beginning? I thought it was really interesting. I also want to mention a really strong model of retaining neurodiverse employees. So JP Morgan has a program called Autism at Work. And that program pairs neurodivergent employees with training, along with, it pairs them with buddies and mentors. And these buddies do everything from having conversations about work to sitting with their buddy and having lunch, right? But there is an intentional program designed to develop and support individuals with autism. And I think it's a beautiful model that we can consider when we're discussing retention?
Most definitely. And I think both of you hit a couple points that I really want to highlight is that often managers are so important. Managers are so important, period. Even in the work that we do at our office, it really is a lot of our training ends up going down to how can we support managers to make sure they are cultivating and developing diverse talent, right? People may not always include persons with disabilities in that diverse category, but they are. And I think, how can organizations really build that culture of we're willing to do something different to support our employees? Like, what are some first steps that maybe, and I sent questions to y'all in advance, and I'm sorry, this is not a part of the question. This wasn't part of my list initially. But I think some people want like tangible, what are our first steps to kind of start building this inclusive workplace environment? A lot of times people talk about it in terms of race or gender or other variables of diversity. But a lot of times our managers are kind of the first line soldiers, essentially. It's not the CEO. It's the people who are working directly with the employees to really create this culture of inclusivity. What are some things that first steps that organizations can take to really narrow in being okay to do something different and not really maintain status quo when it looks at supporting and developing their employees?
For me, the starting point is truly mindset and interrogating organizational priorities, as well as the mindsets, the beliefs, and the biases that we each carry. And so in thinking about when I observe teachers and I'm looking for outcomes related to their equity mindset, the starting point is always conscious incompetence, right? I know that I don't know how to do this, right? And then we move through this process of understanding and gaining knowledge, gaining a deeper understanding of what we don't know. But I think it's really important that we really start with mindset and organizations interrogate there so that they can begin building.
I definitely think there's something to that. And I did mention a lot of the workshops that I do, again, based on communication, because I think when we think about employees, they're in the day-to-day like minutia of, they're not focused on how is my employee taking this information, what are they doing? They're usually rushing so much because there's deadlines to meet, they got this, they have that. Not priority. What's their priority is immediately in front of them, and that is what they understand. They do not necessarily understand the perspective of their employees or their managers. They might think that they do. They might try to do that, but I usually try and reset and pull everybody back to a neutral place. And a lot of what I do is helping them discover what their strengths are, what are the strengths of their team. And a lot of people do testing for this and like Myers-Briggs. Personally, those can be great too. I try and do something totally different because I want it to all be fun. I want it to be neutrally fun, see people as people, not just employees, but seeing them as a whole person and what they bring to the table. And if they can let loose a little bit, I think it really lends to seeing what else they can bring to the table, because there might be skill sets that are not being used in that setting. So I think that if your company is open to doing a reset, whether you are doing an all-day training, literally taking all of the actual external work out of it and bringing something in that's fun, engaging, supportive teamwork activities, even those teamwork activities can be really insightful and help bridge the gap in communication from the top person on your team to the lowest person on your team, to be able to feel comfortable to say what their needs are.
Thank you so much for sharing, Alex. And I think one of the things in the research I did, even preparing for this, and I read a study actually this morning about how folks are not comfortable in disclosing to their organization about their disability. And I saw literally an article today was saying over 64% of employees are worried about the stigma and the discrimination that may come out from them, come out to them from management, even from their peers, if they disclose their learning disability or any neurological disorder. I will say personally, I know persons who've been diagnosed as an adult. What do you say to someone who maybe is newly diagnosed, trying to navigate this with their workplace? Some people who maybe their workplace isn't aware of this difference and how they can maybe support it. What do you say to that employee that may be new and they have this fear in the back of their head about maybe possible discrimination once they disclose?
This is a very real fear, and one that I talk to my clients about on a daily basis. There are a lot of ways to advocate for yourself and your needs without actually disclosing anything. All of what I have said up until this point is about what your needs are, whether you were neurodivergent or not, understanding what your needs are and how to advocate for themselves. And if we're breaking down the communication style to show that at every level that there are some weaknesses within the structure that everybody needs support, it makes it a little bit easier. Most people who are being diagnosed with ADHD are actually adults, and most of the time they are actually women and people of color who are being diagnosed in their 30s and 40s. So it's really hard to understand yourself in this new lens, understand what your needs are. And that's really where I try and start with the individual themselves so that they can feel a little more comfortable understanding what their needs are. So I tend to have people journal for themselves. And when I say journal, I do not mean like pages and pages of notes. I'm saying it's 1:32. I've been in a meeting. This is how I'm feeling, and write a sentence. Check in with yourself throughout the day and figure out what your needs are. And if you feel like there are highs and lows within your day of when you are more focused or when you are not, how can you frame your day to fit those needs? And if that's a structural issue within your company of adjusting your time, how can you talk to them about, I've realized that I am much more focused in the morning, and I would really like to shift some of our meetings to the afternoon, or whatever the case is. At least you understand what those needs are and ask, and none of what I said is going to expose you in a different way.
Brittany, anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll echo what Alex said. I was actually diagnosed with a learning disability in the area of math as an adult in my doctoral program. And while I can't say that I've necessarily disclosed it formally in professional settings, I also have the privilege of not having to use a lot of math every day in my particular role, except for when I'm doing budgeting, which luckily we've got the Excel files and Excel sheets to do the calculations for you. However, I absolutely would say and echo what Alex said about how understanding my own disability really helped me to identify where and how I needed support. So I'm able to say, this is the type of support I will need. I'll need access to a budget calculator. I'll need access to blank. That's simply because I know my own disability. And so quite frankly, I would say that these days in the workforce, many people are privileged to have options. And I think we're getting to the point where employees can and should reflect on, do I want to work for an organization where it doesn't feel safe for me to disclose? Oftentimes, organizations work with third-party affiliates in order to conduct either equity audits or really get at the heart of the workforce. And oftentimes, I think those types of, third-party audits can support really getting the authentic perspectives of the workforce as well. And so, yeah, my advice would just be for people to question and advocate for themselves.
I definitely agree with that. And I just wanted to add, that's one of the things that I talk to a lot of my clients about as they're trying to interview for a new place, is if you understand what your needs are and you're going into this interview process and you say to them, knowing yourself that you like to work at certain hours of the day, that you're more efficient at that time, and you say, is there flexibility within that? And they're like, yeah, I don't know. I'm like, here's your red flag that this wouldn't work for you. So you're not necessarily ending up in the place that is not going to support those needs. I also just want to add one other aspect of this, which was partially why I started this business, of understanding the fact that I had resources and then I didn't, because I was comfortable talking about my dyslexia and ADHD, and I had resources in school. I thought in my first interviews, 22 years old, that if I told somebody I had dyslexia and ADHD, that they understood what that meant. They do not. And that was something that I wish I had understood in this process, because I thought just by explaining the fact that I had dyslexia and ADHD, they automatically knew what services they were going to need to support me. And they didn't. And I shouldn't have come in with that expectation, but I didn't know what I didn't know. So that's why I usually try and remind people, this is what your needs are and how can you talk about it.
Thank you so much for sharing, Alex and Brittany. I think we actually have a question in the Q&A that leads right up to this. So Sandy asked, what advice would you provide to equip leaders and interview teams with the skills needed to interview neurodiverse candidates that may appear awkward during the interview? And how can we help leaders not make a judgment because they are uncomfortable? I think this aligns a lot with what you're saying. Most people don't understand how different, how things show up, and they may not understand dyslexia. They may not understand anyone that's neurodiverse. What advice would you give to help equip those leaders and interview teams to actually really put aside maybe bias, because maybe they feel uncomfortable with how someone is showing up and during that interview process?
Yeah, I was actually just going to say, I would beg us to question who gets to define what awkward is, right? And, I think it does really start deeply with bias and ensuring that interview teams have a deep understanding of their own perceptions, beliefs about what is normal, what is typical. I think it's also really important for us to examine interview protocols, because there really should not be an opportunity for bias, right? We want to do the best we can to remove questions that may allow us to be biased. And so, yeah, those are my suggestions for interview teams.
I think those are really great points. The client that I was talking to, who was an MBA student looking for an internship, they had, in this interview process, given her the questions beforehand and allowed her to record her answers beforehand. So it took a lot of the pressure off, because she was able to, I don't want to say rehearse, but she was able to put her best foot forward and send them what her answers were, instead of being caught off guard. And sometimes that's what causes a lot of the quote unquote awkwardness, because they're trying to process the information and put the right answer out there. And it's not necessarily that they are, again, not capable of that job or having the right answer for it. It's that being on the spot is the part that makes them awkward and uncomfortable. So I think that was an amazing tactic. I know it worked really well for her, but I know a lot of other clients and people that would definitely make them feel much more comfortable. And it would also send the message about the company that they were willing to do something that felt out of the box.
Most definitely. Chloe agrees that strength-based questions and neurodiverse affirming language is so important and effective in spotlighting talent rather than sticking to a deficit-based assumption mindset. And I think even when you think about interviewing and how people communicate, oh, they didn't have eye contact. He didn't want to shake my hand. Things like that, people are like, it's off-putting, we don't want him. But we do have to think about a broader lens. There are some people who do not want to just stare into people's eyes, and they're uncomfortable with eye contact. There are some people that's like, the strong handshake, they're not really open to touch all the time. So understanding that there is a range in how people can show up, and that those stereotypical interview tips that we got back in 1980, 1990s don't really apply to the world that we live in today. And I think there is a really big space to have conversations with organizations about how do we eliminate that bias that people may perceive you should be doing something. And then that person doesn't show up as their, as what they would say is the ideal candidate, but that doesn't mean that they don't have the skills.
That I feel like I can sum up a lot of what we've been discussing just based on that point alone, of understanding that every job description that you're putting out there is not, every person is not going to have every aspect of that job perfectly, but you are going to prioritize what's the most important piece and value for you. You're going to think of your team dynamic and what is important for you. And it's also the aspect that Brittany has mentioned in terms of mentoring. You can finesse the parts of how can they communicate differently if they have to be external, but the skills that you can't make up for that they bring are much harder to find. So if you can find ways to give them the place to succeed, then you can work on the rest and help them develop those other skills with other job training pieces that are going to help you see a much better productivity across the board.
I'm also thinking about the potential power of just being intentional in the interview debrief conversation. So what would it look like for a team to give themselves space to say, okay, before we discuss this candidate, like what potential biases might influence our interpretation of that interview? Just what would it look like to be intentional in that way in a debrief discussion with a team about a candidate's performance in a given interview? So just wanted to add that.
And we do have another question in our Q&A around what advice do we have to introduce interview protocols that provide leaders with sensitivity training around removing implicit bias with neurodiverse candidates. Any advice around that? I hope that people have interview protocols. We talk to people and they're just kind of like winging it as well. So
sorry, I was just processing the question.
Same. Part of me thinks that there's actually different protocols for different types of jobs. And I think that's actually where I'm getting caught up in this. And Brittany, I'm not sure where you're going with this, but when you're interviewing someone for a job, and I'm assuming we're talking first round interview, is that like the screening process? Is that more along the lines of what we're talking about?
Yeah, probably around first round interview, that initial, yes, Nancy says yes,
okay.
The screening process.
So I think it's really important to talk to who that person is going to work for, and talk about what is missing from their team, because there is a team dynamic of what is going to be helpful moving forward, and it has to gel with that person. And I don't want to make it sound like each process should be individualized, but I kind of do, because of the job that they're looking for, or the role that they're looking to fill, or the team they are trying to build. Because I used to row crew in high school. If you are one of those people who is rowing in a boat and you are not fully in sync with everybody in front of you, the boat doesn't move. And that's, I think, the most important part of this. So I think you need to talk about that process of what do you see is missing, what is most important for you, and again, help them understand what the strengths that they are looking for, because that will change how they go about the rest of the interview process, and understanding that if what they're looking for is a data analytics person, that there's a very good chance that the best type of candidate for that is someone who's neurodiverse. And be open to the fact that this might be the best well-rounded candidate for that. I'm not sure if that really answered your question. I hope it was helpful. But Brittany, I'm curious if you have anything to add.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I just think when we're looking at interview protocols, we really need to ask ourselves with each question, what are we as a team looking to get from this question? What information are we looking to receive, right? Is that information up to interpretation based on how this question is worded? Does this question really get at a person's skill level to accomplish blank task, right? So I think we have to ask ourselves those types of questions. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, in having conversations when we're designing the protocol and after administering the protocol, how do we loop back around to the team's processing and have candid conversations about, hey, do we not like how this candidate answered the question? Or, do we not like the actual answer, right? Because if we don't like how they answered it, that's one thing. But is it that we don't like that, or we don't like the actual answer and we don't feel like it's appropriate for the role? So I think just really being specific, interrogating the questions and the outcomes that we're seeking from questions that we're asking.
Yeah, and it looks like Nancy is very grateful for y'all's answer, because asking ourselves the 5 whys when we ask our interview questions are always important. And I do think what it brings to mind is that the basic takeaway from today, if anything else, is being intentional when hiring. I think so many people like to, or they have to rush that process in some way. We need to hurry up and get this hired. We have this due soon, whether we're on a financial deadline for a client or a grant or something. We see so many people rushing through the hiring process. And we know when we rush through the hiring process, even the customers we talk to, you rush, people are just finding folks that, oh, I have an affinity with this person. Oh, okay, I went to school with Brittany. I can hire Brittany. Let's just get the ball rolling. It's the easy thing to do. Alex knows someone that I know. A former friend, a colleague. Okay, yeah, I can just hire Alex. That's the easiest thing to do. But we're missing a lot of the intentionality in the hiring process, and it's causing organizations to make these kind of off the cuff decisions, or really allow bias to creep in and saying, oh, well, we don't think this person's a good fit, because we're not willing to push the envelope or think outside the box, because we're often rushing our processes. I know we talked a little bit about retaining neurodiverse and employees and developing. Do you feel like, is there a special angle on retaining a neurodiverse employee versus any other type of employee, in terms of ensuring that we're retaining and developing person? Is there a different angle that folks may not be thinking of in this process when we think about retaining?
Dr. Ingram, you're cutting off a little bit, but I think I can jump in to respond to your question about anything else we can think of when we're thinking about retention. And I would just like to add that just as we teach educators in the K through 12 setting, this work is highly individualized and highly relational. And disabilities are so unique. There's such a wide spectrum of disability, and how it impacts each individual is so unique. And so I think I go back to the word flexibility and a willingness to be flexible, and a willingness of managers to be flexible in how they support individuals, all individuals, right? But what it looks like, right? The standard management check-in plan that is used for one individual, the standard agenda may need to be different for another, right? And so thinking about the need just to individualize our retention efforts for this population.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brittany. Alex, your thoughts?
I totally agree with that. I think that is very personalized. The other thing I was thinking as you were saying flexibility is literally the flexibility of time. I remember one of my clients was working at a company that was tracking her mouse movements as she was working from home. And when she told me that, I almost fell out of my chair, because if you know anybody who has ADHD specifically, they have this amazing ability to hyper focus, and they can do hours worth of work in an hour. And so someone checking their mouse and feeling like Big Brother is watching them made them not feel confident in their role or in their manager, and everything else started to fail because they were so nervous about the time frame specifically that was set by somebody else. And so having the flexibility to set times with you, so it's not just like, hey, it's a free-for-all, work when you can. It was more the, I trust you enough to set up the time that works best for you. Give me a heads up of when you think those timeframes are, makes a huge difference. As some clients are now going back into their offices, some are in person, some are hybrid, some are totally remote. I've talked to a lot of my consultant clients about setting up places in their spaces, because a lot of businesses that I've been talking to had very big offices and now are kind of hoteling their spaces. So it means that they don't actually have a very regimented desk or a place that they can go. And so I've been talking to clients about, or like consulting clients about setting up spaces within their office that are kind of low lighting, that are much more flexible, or like a quiet space. So when we're taking calls or you're really overstimulated, that you can have a place that makes you feel comfortable. It's hard to go from being at home, potentially having a closed door office, to being in a very stimulated, high volume office, and tend to be less productive there because there's so much interaction. So what can you create in your physical space that is much easier for them to feel productive?
Alex, you took my last question and talking about returning from remote work into the office and what impacts exist there. Brittany and I used to work at a place where it was one woman in our row of cubes who was loud, just all the time loud on the phone, whether you were talking to the school, whether they were talking to a partner or her family. I'm like, we heard her conversation all the time. So it was so hard for us to even focus. But this was our in-office day, and we were forced, like we had to be there. And it really, as there is this push of return to work, the impact on all employees, but particularly neurodivergent employees, to show up as their best selves and do the quality of work that they were doing at home is significantly impacted. So I think that is a big point that we also want to show, during this conversation today, HR professionals and folks who are making kind of those rulings of you need to come back, what that impact may look like. Holly did share. Alex, you wanted to say something?
I was just going to say, my husband is in one of those very big office settings that came back, and they keep trying to find ways to incentivize employees to come back physically into the space, and they gave everybody noise canceling headphones, which I thought was a really interesting way to make it easier across the board, so that when he is in that space. And they also, every time you check in, to check in for your hotel desk, they tell you where the quiet rooms are. And I think that that was a really intentional way to make it easier for those employees who might be struggling being back in their office.
Yeah, I think that's a great tip. And then you are welcoming some people who join your organization for the first time and never been to your offices, right? So how do our leadership teams create that onboarding of welcoming folks back, and to make sure they know how to navigate that space, and thinking about everybody who may be coming back to work, who maybe never even been there before, and what their needs may be. Quiet rooms, nursing rooms, prayer rooms, whatever is available for people, making sure that it's very clear on what that directory looks like for folks. And for those people working at home, Holly agrees that the anxiety level of intensity that comes when people are doing those mouse tracker things, people really, a lot of folks have talked about the anxiety that that causes, and it's really distracting. And this pressure of, do people feel like I'm working? Because you are constantly being tracked. And it brings up a whole nother can of worms for people, and that anxiety that creates when you know Big Brother is watching. People may be seeing how long it may take you to do a task, and folks may not want to share that. As we close out our discussion today, I want to thank everyone so much for the amazing questions and the engagement in the chat, and our amazing panelists. As we close out to our panelists, I would love for you to just spend maybe final 30 seconds of, if you are, for our folks who may be on the call, who are HR professionals, what is the first next step for folks to maybe think about, okay, we do need to have a more inclusive interview process or space for neurodiverse employees. A first step for folks, and really moving forward in that process of creating a more culture of belonging for all employees. Any thoughts to share, Brittany or Alex?
I just think, be flexible, be willing to disrupt the status quo of how things have been done. And thank you, Dr. Ingram, for the opportunity to chat today.
You kind of took the words out of my mouth, but that was basically what I was going to say in terms of understanding and flexibility, and that it's okay to think outside the box. That's actually, if we all thought the same way, there would be no innovation, there would be no change. And usually your greatest innovators are the ones you're ignoring. So let's bring them a little more up front and give them the power to succeed in your workplace so that you can get the best from everybody.
Perfect. We want to thank everyone for joining our discussion today. And for those who are looking for those recertification credits, I have now shared that on the screen. We want to thank everyone for sharing their time with us this afternoon. And we're getting a lot of rave reviews of your comments, and really sharing your tips for folks. And again, this is another element of diversity that we do not talk about enough. And I'm very happy to be able to blend kind of my former life with special education with the diversity, equity, inclusion work I'm doing with OurOffice, and really highlighting a blind spot that often exists for folks here. So thank you so much for your time. And again, the recertification credits are here on the screen. If you have any final ways, we will link this presentation to our events page, where you will be able to get the contact information of Alex and Brittany if you want to reach out to them to learn more about what they do, or even see what services they can do to support your organizations. Or if you are an employee who need kind of support and coaching, feel free to reach out to Alex. Her link is also shared on our events page as well. And we want to thank everyone for attending our webinar today. Our panelists, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with our our wonderful network of folks. And we hope to find ways to kind of continue this discussion around really acknowledging disability and diversity of thought as an element of diversity through the work that we're doing, as many organizations are building out their DEI plans and structures, really making sure that they do not forget about this population of folks who are a part of their workforce, whether they have declared that or not with you. Folks are there, and really making sure they have spaces to be accommodating and supportive of all employees. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.